Part 1. The Paradise. Long ago, before cities were built and before men had taken over the lands, there existed a paradise hidden deep in the heart of nature. It was not just any forest, but a place so magical that even the winds carried songs of joy. The trees stood like guardians of time, tall and proud, their green crowns touching the sky as if they wished to whisper secrets to the clouds. Each morning, when the sun rose from the horizon, its golden rays spilled through the branches, painting the forest floor with light and warmth. Rivers wound through the jungle like silver ribbons, their waters so clear that a stone lying at the bottom looked as if it was floating in the air. When the sun touched the surface, the water glittered like diamonds, and the fish swam happily beneath the sparkling surface. Every living creature had a place in this forest. Birds were the messengers of the morning, greeting the world with their sweet melodies. Parrots laughed and chattered together, filling the air with cheerful noise, while nightingales sang songs so pure that even the breeze seemed to pause and listen. Monkeys swung joyfully from tree to tree, chasing each other in endless games, their laughter echoing through the branches. Deer moved gracefully between the bushes, their soft steps so light that even the leaves beneath their feet barely stirred. Tigers roamed like silent kings, strong and proud, yet never cruel, for this forest was their kingdom and every animal their subject. Elephants marched with dignity, their heavy steps shaking the earth like drums, yet their hearts were gentle, and they cared for the young ones of the forest as if they were all part of one big family. This was a land without fear. No animal harmed another unnecessarily. There was balance, a silent agreement between predator and prey, between the strong and the weak. Hunger was satisfied, thirst was quenched, and life flowed like a never-ending melody. Even the nights were peaceful. When the sun set, the stars would scatter across the sky, and the moonlight would bathe the forest in silver. Fireflies danced like tiny lanterns among the trees, while owls watched over the night, their eyes glowing like little suns in the darkness. Wolves howled, but their voices were not cries of sorrow, rather songs that blended with the music of the night. In this paradise, time seemed to stand still. Generations of animals lived and thrived. Newborns learned to walk, fly, or swim under the watchful eyes of their parents. The rivers never dried, the trees never stopped growing, and the air never lost its fragrance. It was a place where harmony was not a dream, but reality. One morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the forest awoke in its usual beauty. Birds rose into the air like colorful clouds, monkeys stretched lazily after a night of play, and deer bent down to drink from the fresh waters of the stream. The elephants gathered near the lake, where the little ones splashed and rolled happily, spraying water into the air like fountains. Butterflies, painted with all the colors of the rainbow, fluttered around the flowers, while bees hummed softly, carrying golden pollen from one bloom to another. The forest was alive, breathing in rhythm with the earth itself. High up in the branches, a wise old owl watched everything. His feathers were gray and white, his eyes deep and calm. He had lived through many seasons, through rains and summers, through storms and peaceful nights. He had seen the forest grow and thrive, and he often thought to himself that no greater treasure could exist in the world. For here, every leaf, every stone, every drop of water had a story to tell. And all these stories blended into one, the story of life. On the far edge of the jungle, where the forest touched the mountains, the rivers roared with energy as they rushed down the slopes. Waterfalls thundered as they fell from the rocks above, sending sprays of mist into the air. Rainbows appeared every morning in the fine droplets, and animals often gathered near these places, not only to drink, but to marvel at the beauty that surrounded them. To them, it was not just a home, it was a gift, a sacred place that nourished their bodies and souls. Even the smallest creatures had their part to play. Ants carried food with incredible patience, building their tiny kingdoms beneath the soil. Frogs croaked by the ponds, announcing the coming of rain. Lizards basked in the sun, their scales shining like jewels. Snakes slid silently through the undergrowth, but they too were part of the great harmony. Each creature, no matter how small or large, was a note in the symphony of the forest. When storms came, the animals were not afraid. The trees bent with the wind but never broke, and the rivers swelled but never overflowed. The forest had a strength of its own, a resilience that had lasted for centuries. Every challenge that came was met with patience, and life always found a way to continue. This was the way it had always been. A paradise of peace, a treasure of hope, a dream made real on the earth. No one could imagine that such a place could ever fade, that such joy could ever end. For to the animals of the forest, their world was eternal, unshakable, and everlasting. But time is like the river, it flows, and sometimes it carries with it shadows from far away. Hidden beyond the mountains, far beyond the rivers, storms were gathering. The skies that once smiled blue and golden would one day frown with gray and anger. None of the animals knew it yet. To them, each day was a blessing, each night a gift. They lived without worry, without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Yet, destiny was slowly preparing a test for them. A test of fire, of courage, and of hope. And though the forest still sang its songs, somewhere deep in the silence of time, a whisper was rising, a whisper of sorrow that would one day change everything. For now, however, the forest of hope lived in the light. It was still the paradise of dreams, still the land of laughter and joy. Its story was far from over, though none could see the shadows that waited beyond the horizon. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the rivers sparkled in the sun, and the animals lived their days in peace, never knowing how precious, how fragile their paradise truly was. Part 2. The Storm of Sorrow. The days of joy continued for many seasons. Rain fell when it was needed, sunshine came to warm the earth, and life grew in harmony. The forest had never known fear. But nature, like time, is full of secrets. One evening, the air felt different. The winds that usually carried the fragrance of flowers now came with a heavy stillness. The sky, once clear and endless, darkened with heavy clouds that rolled in from the distance. The animals noticed first in small ways. Birds that usually fill the air with songs suddenly fell quiet. Monkeys stopped their games and held tightly to the branches. Deer lifted their heads from the grass, their ears twitching at sounds too faint for most to hear. Even the mighty elephants, with their strength and wisdom, stood uneasily, sensing that the heart of the forest was troubled. That night, as the moon tried to rise above the clouds, lightning split the sky. A flash of white light tore across the heavens, followed by the roar of thunder that shook the very ground. Rain began to fall, not in gentle drops, but in fierce sheets that pounded the leaves and turned the soil to mud. The rivers, once calm, roared as water rushed faster and faster down their paths. At first, the animals thought it was only a storm. They had seen storms before. Trees bent under the force of the wind, but they always stood again. The rivers swelled, but the waters always returned to their gentle song. The forest had always survived. But this storm was different. The lightning came again, brighter and louder than before. It struck a tall tree on the edge of the jungle. In an instant, the tree exploded with fire. Flames leapt upward, glowing against the dark sky, hungry and alive. The rain tried to fight it, but the fire spread faster than the drops could fall. The wind carried sparks from branch to branch, igniting the dry leaves, and soon the forest itself was burning. The animals panicked. The parrots screeched in terror, flapping their wings as they rose into the blackened sky. Monkeys scrambled higher, only to find the flames reaching up to meet them. Tigers, who had always walked with dignity, now roared in fear as they searched for safety. Deer ran desperately, their hooves splashing through the mud, trying to outrun the fire that chased them like a shadow. Even the mighty elephants, protectors of the jungle, trumpeted loudly, calling their little ones to follow as they fled through the smoke. The fire was everywhere. Trees that had stood for centuries cracked and crashed to the ground, their burning trunks sending sparks high into the air. The rivers, once so clear, boiled with falling embers. Smoke rose so thick that the stars disappeared, and the moon was hidden behind a curtain of darkness. The night that should have been peaceful became a nightmare. Some animals tried to save their homes. Birds carried water in their beaks, dropping it onto the flames, but the fire only laughed and grew stronger. Monkeys tried to beat the flames with leaves, but the fire swallowed the leaves in an instant. Elephants sprayed water from the rivers onto the trees, but even their strength could not stop the blaze. The fire was merciless. It did not care for the songs of the birds, the games of the monkeys, or the wisdom of the elephants. It wanted only to consume, to turn everything into ashes. As the fire spread, animals became separated. Mothers cried out for their young, their voices lost in the roar of the flames. Little ones stumbled in the smoke, their eyes burning, unable to see where to go. Strong animals turned back again and again, trying to help the weak, but the fire showed no mercy. The harmony that had held the forest together was broken in a single night of terror. By midnight, the paradise was unrecognizable. The green crowns of the trees were replaced by fiery towers of red and orange. The sweet fragrance of flowers was lost beneath the choking smell of smoke. The songs of the birds, the laughter of the monkeys, the trumpet of the elephants, all were drowned in the crackling roar of fire. Some animals escaped. They ran to the farthest edges of the forest, where the flames could not reach. They gathered together on the riverbanks, trembling as they watched their home burn. But many could not escape. The forest that had once protected them now became their prison. For every animal that survived, another fell to the fire. The paradise of laughter and peace was collapsing into a graveyard of ash. The wise old owl, who had always watched over the forest, sat on a high branch as the fire closed in. His feathers were singed, his wings heavy with smoke, but his eyes remained calm. He knew the forest better than anyone, and even as the flames devoured the trees, he whispered to himself, "This is not the end. Life will return, though sorrow walks here now." But for the animals below, there was no comfort. The night was endless, the fire unstoppable. When dawn finally broke, the sky was gray with smoke, and the sun appeared as a pale, lifeless disk. The fire had slowed, but only because it had nothing left to burn. The forest was gone. The animals who had survived stepped cautiously into what was once their home. They saw only blackened trees, their branches twisted like broken arms reaching for help that never came. The rivers were choked with ash, their waters dark and lifeless. The flowers were gone, the butterflies gone, the music gone. Silence fell upon the forest, a silence so heavy it felt like a stone pressing against the heart. The paradise was no more. What had once been full of life and joy was now a desert of sorrow. The animals lowered their heads, their spirits broken, for they could not imagine how such a place could ever live again. And yet, deep within the ashes, unseen by eyes filled with tears, the earth still held a secret that waited for the right moment. For though the fire had taken much, it could not take everything. Beneath the burned soil, seeds slept quietly, waiting for a chance to rise again. But the animals did not know this. To them, their world had ended. All they could feel was grief. All they could see was loss, and all they could hear was silence. The storm of sorrow had passed, but it had left behind wounds that no one believed could ever heal. Part 3. The silence after fire. When the storm of sorrow finally ended, the forest was no longer the same. The flames had died, the thunder had passed, and the wind no longer carried the sound of fire. Yet what remained was even harder to bear than the night of terror itself. Silence. A silence so deep that it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. The animals who had survived crept out from their hiding places with slow and uncertain steps. They had fled to the riverbanks, to caves, or to the far edges of the forest where the fire could not follow. Now they returned, their eyes wide with disbelief, as they saw what had become of their once beautiful paradise. The tall green trees that had touched the sky were gone. In their place stood blackened skeletons, broken and twisted, reaching upward like hands frozen in pain. The fresh green leaves were no more. The branches were bare, stripped of life, covered only in soot and ash. The air that once carried the fragrance of flowers was heavy with smoke, a bitter smell that stung the nose and burned the lungs. The rivers, once crystal clear, were now dark and polluted. Ash floated on their surface, and the fish that had once danced in the sunlight lay lifeless, carried by the current. The ground, which had been soft with grass and flowers, was now hard and cracked, covered in black dust that clung to the paws and hooves of the animals as they walked. No butterflies fluttered, no bees hummed, no fireflies glowed. The birds, usually the messengers of morning, perched silently on the remains of burned branches. Their wings were heavy, their eyes empty. They no longer sang. The monkeys, who had once filled the forest with laughter, sat close together, their arms wrapped around one another, staring at the ruins of their playground. The deer, usually graceful and calm, now trembled with every sound, their heads lowered in sorrow. Even the tigers, the proud rulers of the jungle, moved slowly, their roars replaced by silence. The elephants, protectors of the forest, walked among the ruins with heavy steps, their trunks lowered to the ground in mourning. It was as if the heart of the forest had stopped beating. The harmony was gone, the music lost, and the laughter silenced. What remained was emptiness. Days passed, and the silence only grew heavier. The animals searched for food, but there was little to be found. The grass had burned away, the fruit trees were gone, and the rivers no longer carried enough fish. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, thirst dried their throats, and the youngest among them cried out in despair. Mothers searched desperately for something to feed their little ones. Birds flew far in search of berries, but returned with empty beaks. Deer wandered for miles, only to find dust and ashes where green fields had once been. Even the elephants, who could pull down branches and dig for roots, struggled to find enough to share. Thirst was worse than hunger. The rivers that had always been a source of life were now poisoned with ash. The water tasted bitter, and many animals grew sick after drinking it. The little ones coughed and grew weak, their eyes dull with exhaustion. Some animals grew too tired to walk and lay down on the burned earth, waiting for strength that never came. The forest that had once been a paradise now felt like a prison. Everywhere the animals looked, they saw reminders of what they had lost. A broken branch that had once been full of flowers. A pile of ash where a tree had once stood tall. A burned nest hanging from a blackened branch, empty and lifeless. Memories filled their hearts, but those memories only brought more sorrow. The wise old owl, who had survived the fire, sat silently on a charred stump. His feathers were no longer clean and shining. They were marked with soot and smoke. He watched the forest and the animals, his eyes full of sadness, yet deep within them still a spark of patience. He knew that time could heal, that life had its way of returning, but he also knew that the road ahead would be long and painful. The younger animals could not understand. They asked their elders, "Why did the forest burn? Why did the fire come? Will the flowers return? Will we ever sing again?" The elders had no answers. They only lowered their heads in sorrow, unable to explain why such a tragedy had happened. The silence was not only in the forest, but in the hearts of its creatures. Once, they had spoken to each other in joy, shared food, and celebrated the beauty around them. Now their voices were heavy, their words short, their eyes distant. Fear had settled among them, a fear that the paradise they had once known was gone forever. Night fell, but even the nights were no longer the same. Without trees, the forest could not hide its wounds. The moonlight revealed the black scars of the earth, the broken branches, the empty spaces where life had once thrived. The animals huddled together for warmth, their bodies close, but their hearts cold with despair. The owls no longer sang, the wolves no longer howled, the crickets no longer chirped. Even the wind seemed unwilling to pass through the dead trees. The young animals who had been born after the fire saw the forest differently. To them, The green sprouts and the patches of flowers were not signs of loss, but signs of life. They had never known the paradise of the past. To them, this forest, though scarred, was still a wonder. Their eyes shone with curiosity, their steps were full of play, and their laughter reminded the older animals that life always moves forward. One evening, as the sun set in gold and crimson, the animals gathered at the riverbank. The wise old owl looked at them and spoke. "My friends, we have suffered greatly. We lost much, and we still struggle. But look around you. The forest breathes again. The rivers sing again. The flowers bloom again. This is not the forest we once had, but it is a forest we have built together. And together, it will grow strong." The silence was complete. But silence has two faces. One is sorrow, heavy and painful. The other is waiting, quiet and patient. Though the animals did not know it, beneath the ashes seeds were hidden. Tiny seeds, buried in the soil, protected from the fire, waiting for the right moment to wake. The earth had not given up. Life had not been fully destroyed. The fire had stolen much, but it had not taken everything. The owl, wise as always, could feel this truth. He closed his eyes and whispered softly to himself, "The forest is wounded, but it will not die. Time will heal, and hope will return." But the others did not hear him. To them, his words would have been just another sound swallowed by the silence. The days stretched into weeks, and the silence remained. Hunger continued to trouble the animals, thirst continued to weaken them, and sorrow weighed down their spirits. Many wondered if it was better to leave, to wander into the unknown in search of a new home. But even as they thought of leaving, their hearts ached. For this was not just a forest. This was their birthplace, their shelter, their paradise. To abandon it felt like abandoning themselves. And so, they stayed. They stayed in the silence, waiting, not knowing what they were waiting for. The forest stood like a graveyard, yet beneath the ashes, hidden from all eyes, life waited quietly. The silence was heavy, but it was not forever. Part 4. The Ray of Hope. The silence of the burned forest seemed endless. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The sky brought rain, but it only turned the ashes into mud. The sun shone, but it only revealed the black scars of trees and the lifeless ground. The animals grew weaker. Many had lost hope, believing the paradise they once knew could never return. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, the first sign of change appeared. On the edge of the ruined clearing, where the fire had once burned the fiercest, a small green sprout pushed through the ashes. It was fragile and tiny, no taller than a finger, yet it shone with life. Its leaves were soft and delicate, but in their color was the promise of tomorrow. The first to notice was a young deer. Tired and weak, she bent her head to the ground, expecting to find nothing but dust. Instead, she saw the little sprout trembling in the wind, yet refusing to fall. Her eyes widened, and she called softly to the others. Soon, the animals gathered around, staring at the tiny green life. For a long time, none of them spoke. Their hearts were heavy with disbelief. Could such a fragile thing really survive in a land of ashes? But the sprout stood tall, as if to say, "Yes, I am here. The fire is past, but life remains." The parrots, who had been silent for months, let out soft chirps. The monkeys leaned closer, curious, their eyes lighting up with something they had not felt in a long time, wonder. Even the elephants, who had carried the greatest sorrow, lowered their trunks gently to the ground, touching the sprout with care, as if protecting it. The wise old owl, perched above on a broken branch, looked down at the scene. His eyes gleamed softly. He had known that life would return, but even he had not expected it so soon. He spoke in his calm voice, "Life is patient. Even in the darkest of times, it waits." This little sprout is the forest's promise that all is not lost. The animals listened. For the first time since the fire, they felt something stir within their hearts. It was small and fragile, just like the sprout, but it was powerful. It was hope. As days passed, the rain continued to fall, and the sprout grew taller. Soon, others began to appear. Tiny shoots of grass broke through the black soil. Small flowers lifted their heads, their petals shy but determined. The forest floor, once a desert of ash, began to show patches of green. The animals watched with amazement. The deer found tender leaves to eat, the parrots nibbled at new berries, and bees slowly returned to collect nectar from the first blooming flowers. Frogs croaked again by the ponds, and dragonflies darted above the water. Life, little by little, was returning. The change was not only in the forest, but in the animals themselves. Their voices, once heavy with sorrow, began to lighten. The monkeys played again, though not as wildly as before. The birds tested their songs, their melodies shaky at first, but soon stronger. The elephants trumpeted softly, their sounds carrying a new strength, a strength born from survival. Still, the scars of the fire remained. Many trees stood black and broken. The rivers were not as clean as before, and food was still scarce. The animals knew they could not simply wait for the forest to heal itself. They had to help. One evening, as the sun set in gold and red, the wise old owl called the animals together. His voice was steady and clear. "My friends, the forest has shown us its will to live, but it cannot rise alone. If we wish to see our paradise again, we must work together. Every one of us has a part to play." The animals listened carefully. At first, some were doubtful. They were tired, weak, and unsure if they had the strength to rebuild. But then they looked around at the green shoots, at the little flowers pushing through the ashes, and they realized that even the smallest seed could find the strength to rise again. The elephants were the first to step forward. "We will bring water from the rivers," they said, spraying it over the dry soil to help new plants grow. The parrots promised to carry seeds far and wide, dropping them into the earth with their beaks. The monkeys offered to gather fallen fruits and spread their seeds across the land. Even the deer, gentle and quiet, said they would tread carefully so as not to harm the new sprouts and help protect them from being eaten too soon. Every animal found a task. The tigers and wolves, once feared as hunters, promised to guard the young plants from being destroyed. The bees and butterflies returned to carry pollen from flower to flower, ensuring that new life would spread. Even the smallest ants worked tirelessly, moving seeds into the ground, unknowingly planting the future. Together, they began the work of healing. Day by day, little by little, the forest started to change. Where once there was only silence, now there was the sound of effort, the splash of water from elephants, the chatter of parrots as they dropped seeds, the rustle of monkeys carrying fruits, the hum of bees flying from flower to flower. It was not easy. Many days were still hard. Food was limited, and the work was tiring. Some animals grew discouraged, feeling the task was too great. But whenever despair returned, they looked at the little sprout, the first sign of hope, and remembered how it had stood tall even in the ashes. If a tiny plant could survive, so could they. As weeks passed, the change became clear. The ground was no longer black, but dotted with green. Small trees began to grow, their branches reaching upward. Flowers painted the land with color: red, yellow, blue, and white. The rivers, slowly cleansed by rain and time, began to sparkle again, and fish returned to dance in their waters. The forest was not yet what it had been, but it was no longer a graveyard. It was alive once more, breathing, singing, and healing. The animals gathered one evening beneath the first young tree that had grown tall enough to cast a shadow. They rested in its shade, and for the first time since the fire, they felt peace. The owl looked at them and spoke. "Remember this, my friends. Fire may destroy, but it cannot defeat life. As long as we hold hope in our hearts, the forest will always return." The animals lifted their heads. Their eyes shone brighter than before, not only with hope, but with determination. They had learned a truth that night. The forest was not just their home. It was part of them. and together they would bring it back. The ray of hope had become a flame of courage. Part 5. The struggle to rebuild. The little sprout had awakened hope, and the animals of the forest had begun their work. Day after day, they carried seeds, brought water, and guarded the young plants. The silence of sorrow had slowly turned into the sound of life. Yet rebuilding a paradise was not simple. The fire had left deep scars, and every step forward seemed to bring new challenges. The soil, blackened by flames, was hard in many places. Seeds that the parrots dropped did not always grow. Some were swallowed by ash, others dried before they could sprout. The elephants sprayed water from the rivers, but the rivers themselves were weak, carrying only small trickles compared to what they once had. The monkeys spread fruits and seeds, but many rotted in the dry ground before roots could take hold. Hunger continued to trouble the animals. Though grass had returned in patches, there was not enough for the deer. The parrots found only a few berries, barely enough to fill their stomachs. The tigers and wolves, strong and fierce, grew thinner as their prey grew scarce. Even the elephants, who could survive on bark and roots, sometimes went hungry. The young ones cried at night, and their mothers tried to comfort them, but their hearts were heavy. Despite the hardship, the animals did not give up. Every morning, when the sun rose, they gathered to continue their work. The elephants walked long distances to bring water. The parrots searched tirelessly for seeds. The monkeys climbed high into the mountains, finding fruits where the fire had not reached, and carried them back to share. Each animal, great or small, did what it could. The wise old owl reminded them often, rebuilding is not the task of a day or a season. It is the work of patience. Just as a tree takes years to grow tall, so will the forest take time to heal. Do not lose courage. But courage was tested often. Storms came again, bringing heavy winds that tore at the young shoots. Some of the new plants broke and fell. The animals cried out in despair, but once the storm passed, they returned to work, planting again, guarding again. When the rivers dried in the heat of summer, many animals went thirsty, yet they still carried what little water they could find to the young trees. One day, a fire threatened to return. A bolt of lightning struck a dry stump, and flames began to rise. The animals panicked for a moment, memories of the great fire filling their hearts with fear. But this time, they acted quickly. The elephants sprayed water to drown the flames. The monkeys threw wet leaves onto the fire. The deer stomped at the burning grass, and the parrots called loudly, warning others to help. Together, they stopped the fire before it could spread. That day, the animals realized something important. They were no longer helpless. Together, they had the strength to protect their forest. Slowly, very slowly, the forest began to heal. The grass spread wider, covering the ground with green. More flowers bloomed, their colors bright against the gray soil. The rivers grew clearer as the rains washed away the ash. Fish returned, frogs croaked once more, and dragonflies danced above the water. Still, the forest was not the same as before. Many great trees were gone forever, and the land felt smaller, emptier. The animals missed the towering giants that had once touched the sky, the deep shade that had once cooled the earth, the countless fruits that had once filled their stomachs. But even as they missed the past, they began to see beauty in the present. The young trees, though small, were strong. The flowers, though few, were bright. The songs of the birds, though not as loud, were sweet. The young animals who had been born after the fire saw the forest differently. To them, the green sprouts and the patches of flowers were not signs of loss, but signs of life. They had never known the paradise of the past. To them, this forest, though scarred, was still a wonder. Their eyes shone with curiosity, their steps were full of play, and their laughter reminded the older animals that life always moves forward. One evening, as the sun set in gold and crimson, the animals gathered at the riverbank. The wise old owl looked at them and spoke. "My friends, we have suffered greatly. We lost much, and we still struggle. But look around you. The forest breathes again. The rivers sing again. The flowers bloom again. This is not the forest we once had, but it is a forest we have built together. And together, it will grow strong. The animals listened, their hearts filled with pride. They realized that though the fire had taken their paradise, it had also taught them something precious. It had taught them unity. Before, they had lived in harmony without effort because the forest had given them everything. But now, they had learned to work side by side, to protect each other, to share their struggles. The tigers no longer walked with pride alone but with responsibility, guarding the weak. The parrots no longer chattered only for joy but carried seeds with purpose. The elephants, though tired, carried water not just for themselves but for all. Even the smallest ants, moving in endless lines, became part of the great work. Each life, no matter how small, mattered in rebuilding. The struggle was far from over, but it was no longer hopeless. Hope had grown into determination, and determination had begun to bear fruit. The forest was still scarred, but it was alive. And life, once it begins, always finds a way to grow. The animals lifted their heads to the sky that night. The stars shone brighter than they had in many seasons, and the moon cast its silver light upon the young trees. For the first time, the animals felt not sorrow when they looked at the night, but peace. They knew the struggle would continue, but they also knew that together, they would succeed. Part 6. The Forest of Hope. Seasons passed. The sun rose and set again and again. Rains washed the land, winds shaped the soil, and slowly, life returned. The scars of fire did not vanish completely, but they became part of the story of the forest. Where once only ashes lay, now young trees stood, their leaves dancing in the wind. The animals, once broken by sorrow, now walked with pride. The little sprout that had first given them hope had grown into a tall tree. Its branches spread wide, and its shade gave comfort to all. Birds built their nests in it. Monkeys swung from its arms. Deer rested beneath its shadow, and even the tiger lay peacefully nearby. It had become more than just a tree. It was a symbol, a reminder that life, though fragile, could always rise again. The rivers, once thin and weak, now flowed strongly. Fish darted in the water, leaping joyfully in silver arcs. Frogs croaked happily on the banks, and turtles crawled lazily in the sand. The parrots, who had carried seeds across the land, now sang joyfully in the branches of countless young trees. The forest was not only alive, it was thriving. Children of the animals who had suffered the fire now grew up in this new paradise. To them, the dark days were only stories told by their parents. They knew only the bright mornings, the cool rivers, and the laughter of friends. They raced across the fields, played among the trees, and looked up at the sky with eyes full of dreams. The wise old owl watched from his branch, his heart full of peace. He had seen sorrow. He had seen despair. But he had also seen courage, unity, and hope. Now, as he looked upon the forest, he whispered, "The heart of nature beats again." The animals had also changed. They were no longer simply creatures sharing the same land. They had become a family bound not only by the forest, but by the struggle they had faced together. The tiger did not hunt recklessly. The deer no longer feared every shadow. The parrots shared their fruits freely. Even the smallest ant carried food not only for itself, but for its colony, teaching others the meaning of teamwork. One evening, when the sky burned orange with sunset, the animals gathered once again at the riverbank. They looked at the trees swaying in the gentle breeze, at the flowers blooming in every color, at the water shining like liquid gold. Silence fell among them, not the silence of sorrow, but the silence of awe. They had brought the forest back to life. The elephants trumpeted with joy. The parrots filled the air with songs. The monkeys clapped and danced. The deer leapt gracefully, and even the wolves howled, their voices carrying into the night like music. Together, they celebrated not only the forest, but the hope that had guided them through the darkest days. The wise owl spoke once more. My friends, long ago this forest was a paradise. Then came the fire, and it seemed that all was lost. But we have learned something greater than paradise itself. We have learned that even in ashes, hope can bloom. We have learned that together, we are stronger than fire, stronger than storms, stronger than despair. This forest is no longer only a home. It is a promise that life will always return. From that night on, the forest was known by a new name. It was no longer remembered only as the land of sorrow or the land of fire. It became known as the Forest of Hope. Travelers who passed through would stop and wonder at its beauty. They would hear the story of its past and learn its lesson, that hope and unity could heal even the deepest wounds. And so the days turned into months and the months into years. The trees grew tall, their crowns once again touching the sky. The rivers flowed wide and strong. The animals lived with respect for one another, never forgetting the struggle they had endured. The Forest of Hope stood proudly, not as a place untouched by pain, but as a place reborn through courage, patience, and love. It whispered to all who entered, no matter how dark the night, no matter how strong the fire, the dawn will always come, and life will always rise again. And under the stars, in the gentle songs of the birds, in the laughter of the young, and in the rustle of every leaf, the spirit of hope lived forever. The end.